I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence in this audience. I should, I suppose, automatically assume that you all know what Buddhism is. But just in case there are several people here who don't, I'm going to build it from the ground up. And then we're going to get to what Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism is, or what is called more correctly Vajrayana, is about. Now, Buddhism is not exactly the sort of thing that we in the West understand as a religion. It is not a system of belief. It is not attached to certain propositions about the nature of this world. It's not a thing that you really have to join in order to practice it. Buddhism is a practice. Buddhism is essentially experience, not ideas. In fact, in a certain sense, it is a liberation from ideas. Because when human beings long, long ago learned how to talk, learned how to count, and learned how to symbolize the natural world, that in some ways was a very good thing, but you can have too much of a good thing. And as a result of doing this, they started to ruin the world, because they confused the words with reality. Now, of course, if you've been trained in the philosophy department of the University of California, and I would use such a word as reality, you would say, well, what do you mean by reality? Of course you know what reality is. But no one can say what it is. But you all know. But that thing we call reality is what we need to get back into touch with, as distinct from enormous systems of abstractions and words and symbols. Because in pursuing the whole realm of words and symbols, we are destroying our planet. We are working, for example, for the rewards of money rather than the rewards of material wealth. We are working about absurd conflicts between allegedly black people and allegedly white people, neither of whom exist, except as ideas. And it is completely essential to the continuation of human life on this earth, and not only human life, but butterflies, coons, deer, fish, whales, and all sentient beings, that we come to our senses, and that may involve going out of our minds. And so, Buddhism was essentially a discipline in which there is someone called Buddha. This is not a proper name, it's a title. It's someone who's woken up. That's what the word Buddha means. Because you see, what happens is this. The Buddha himself, Gautama Siddhartha, the historic Buddha, felt he had a life problem. He felt that we suffer, we ache, we get diseases, and finally we die. And isn't that weird? You know, an apparent mistake of the universe to have us all in that sort of situation, where it seems that some sort of hope of happiness is dangled in front of us to keep us working, to keep us producing food and raising babies, only in the end it all falls apart. And it's just horrible. And this bugged the Gautama Siddhartha. And he was absolutely determined that he would find out the answer to the problem, which he proceeded to do. Only he found out that the problem was that he asked the wrong questions. That the problem existed because he was hypnotizing himself. Now, when you are little children and you first come into this world, you are simply surrounded with a buzz of vibrations. And you don't know any difference between yourself on the one hand and the universe on the other, between I and thou, between I and it. You don't know what is a good scene and you don't know what's a bad scene. There's just this buzz going on. We'll call it a buzz, for lack of a better word. In Sanskrit it's called tathata, which means suchness, roughly, but it really means when a baby first arrives, and the first noise it makes when it sees anything at all is da, da, da. And male parents in a patriarchal society pride themselves on the idea that the baby is saying dada. The baby is not saying dada in that sense. Father. The baby is just whew, da. See? But then we gradually teach the baby that there are good vibes and bad vibes. That there are vibes that are supposed to happen, like enjoying your food and having a proper bowel movement. And bad vibes, like getting a fever, being in danger of death. And when adults die, everybody wails and mourns, and the baby picks up that death is a bad thing. And so it learns to distinguish between bad things and good things, and good guys and bad guys, and gets this compulsion feeling that it ought to go on living. You must stay alive. It's like saying to somebody, you must go to sleep. It's your duty. And that keeps you wide awake. So we condition our children into a certain interpretation of these vibrations, all of which depends on systems of words, systems of evaluation, which have a certain positive and beneficent use. But when the tool becomes your master and gets out of control, it becomes a monster. And that is what is happening in the world today. That our tools, our machines, our ideas, our systems are in control of us, and that things are in the saddle and ride mankind. And therefore, it is necessary for us to come back to our senses. And what Tibet and what Buddhism represents, not, please, as a missionary system. This is not like Christians out to convert the heathens. This is like ophthalmology, a way of correcting blurred vision. What the tradition here represents is coming back to fundamental contact with reality. And so this is called the practice. I won't call it the doctrine. There is doctrine, yes. There are scriptures, there are books. But basically the whole thing is concerned with experience. And what it is basically concerned with is getting you to learn the art of shutting up inside your head. There's a famous 6 precepts of Tilopa. And my pronunciation of Tibetan is probably terrible. But it says, Manoma Samma Chadching, Magomma Sem Rangbabzad, which means approximately, don't think. Don't be mindful. Don't meditate. But keep your mind in its natural state. Now, that's a very dangerous doctrine for most Westerners, because Westerners have ideas about what it would be like to have your mind in its natural state, and think that being spontaneous and being mindless is being a certain kind of oath. That's a preconception. You don't know. There's no way of thinking what it's like to be in a mindless state. You can't have a conception of it. You can't have a preconceived idea. It's like we have the idea that, for example, this world of nature, you know, this is just material. Now, the idea that these flowers are material is an idea. Other people, say like Christian scientists, have the idea that they're really spiritual. But that's just an idea. It's philosophy. And philosophy has not served us in very good stead. This is not spiritual. This is not material. You see? So, what Buddhism fundamentally teaches is the art of suspending thought. Now, of course, in an academic community, that's a perfectly dreadful idea. In a business community like IBM, where they have a little notice on the wall that says, think. See? That's just terrible. To be thoughtless, to be mindless, is to be an idiot. But the truth of the matter is that if there are no times in your life in which you suspend thinking other than mere sleep, you're quite mad. If I talk all the time, I can't hear what anybody else has to say. Likewise, if I talk subvocally, that is to say, think all the time, I have nothing to think about except thoughts. And therefore, it is vitally important to get back to the fundamental world, which we call reality, and which in Buddhism is called either tathata, da, or shunyata, which is somewhat mistranslated as the void. Everything is shunyata. And of course, Western interpreters, though all Sanskrit and Tibetan was originally translated into English by missionaries who had a vested interest in destroying the validity of these practices because they wanted to convert them to the highly verbal religion of Christianity. In the beginning was the Word. And all our Christian services consist of interminable talking. And despite of the fact that Jesus said, "Be not as the heathens, who think they shall be heard for their much speaking." And whenever there's a moment in a Christian church service when nobody's talking, there's a kind of feeling of embarrassment. There's interminable chatter. And what is absolutely essential to our psychic health is interior silence. not a blank mind in which, it's something like sleep, total voidness of content, but a mind like space. Space contains everything. And space externally, that you think you are surrounded by space, space is actually your consciousness. And it contains everybody else, the sun, the moon, the stars, the whole universe. Space is the nearest image that we can form of shunyata. And because it's basic to everything, you can't say anything about it. See, the only things you can talk about are things you can put in boxes, which are logically called classes. You can say this is, and this is isn't. Because you can say, I have something in my left hand, but I do not have something in my right hand. And thereby you can realize the difference between is and isn't. But what about what underlies all that? In the same way that the eyes underlies sight and particular objects that you can perceive, that hearing underlies sound. What is it that underlies your knowing that you're alive? How do you know you're alive? How do you know you exist? And that it's important to exist and to go on existing and to raise children? How do you know you're there? Because you've got also something called death. You've all been dead before, otherwise you wouldn't know you were alive. Where were you before you were born? So you know what is because you know what isn't is. But can you possibly know what underlies both is and isn't? That's really fundamental. But of course no one can talk about it. It can't be put in a class. So that which underlies both is and isn't is symbolized in Tibetan Buddhism as the diamond, which I hold here in my hand. Of course, you wouldn't think that was a diamond. It's a thunderbolt. It's a flash of lightning. That's what it represents. But it represents everything that you would connect with the idea of a diamond. Now, this is a symbol. The diamond is, first of all, the hardest material object that we know. It will cut all others. Therefore, it's nitty-gritty. It's absolutely basic, real, if by real you mean hard. And people do mean hard and real together. We say that facts are hard facts, or brute facts, and you must face them. This is down to earth, you see. We use all these symbols of hardness to mean reality. And so this represents, in its many, many meanings, the diamond drill, which can go through anything else. The hardest of hard facts. But at the same time, the diamond is the most transparent of substances. Light goes right through it, and in the course of so doing creates all kinds of marvelous colors. So that it's at the same time empty, transparent, translucent, and yet real, hard. And so this is used, therefore, as the symbol of what we all are. We get scared. We think that the whole universe is falling apart on us, that there's some problem, that you've got to look out, because there might be an ultimate and final everlasting tragedy that could occur to all of us. What would that be? What are you finally scared of? What is the awful that's going to happen to you in the end? Well, that's your imagination. That's a system of goosing yourself, because the universe does work with, it uses this principle, that it creeps up on itself and says, boo! And then it laughs at itself for jumping. Because you see, by having the idea that there is something ultimately awful that might happen, that feeling of the awfuls is precisely the point on the diamond. As you feel it with your soft skin, and you realize soft skin by the experience of hardness. The bang of the lightning makes you jump. But in fact, what you basically are is the diamond, the shunyata, the solid emptiness, or the solid space, than which there is no witcher and which there is nothing else. You don't have to put whiskers on it and call it Jehovah, because then you think of yourself as poor little me who bows down before this and is horrified by it and feels guilty. You're it, whatever it is, but there's no way of saying what it is. The Buddhists feel that the Hindus made the mistake of saying too much about what it is. They call it the Brahman, the Parabrahman, the Atman, Paramatman, the self, etc. Buddhists don't say anything about it. They preserve what the Buddha himself was described as maintaining a noble silence. But that noble silence is not what we call agnosticism. It's silence inside your head. And the moment you can get silence inside your head, you understand what I'm talking about. But the question is how to get it, because we're all habitual chatterers. Having, as I said, invented language and symbolism, we are addicted to it and can't stop. And therefore are pursuing life goals that are purely words and purely symbolic. And as a result of that, neglecting the earth. So how do you stop thinking? Well, the trouble is, it's rather like there's a Hindu superstition, we might call it, that if when taking medicine you think of a monkey, the medicine won't work. So you must try not to think of the monkey while taking medicine. So trying not to think is, of course, a form of thinking, because you're pursuing a goal, you're pursuing something in the future. And there is no future. If you stop thinking, you see, you'll find that there was and is only and always a present. There is no future. It's just here. And the future and the past are concepts. But how do you get rid of it? Well, there are very... if you get hung up on the idea of how am I going to do it, and if I practice meditation, surely I'm doing it for a reason, and that reason is a thought, and therefore I have a bad motive for doing it. You get endlessly hung up. The only way is to just go straight into it. And so the devices that have been worked out in Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, which is what we're talking about, the Buddhism of Tibet, are very clever devices. Upaya, they're called, skillful means for stopping thought. And one of the first that's used is pure sound, mantra. We started this evening by chanting mantra. Now, what's the meaning of a mantra? A mantra is a technical device. It's not something like a hymn. It's a technical device, just like this microphone is a technical device, to get you to listen to sound without putting meaning on it. Now, let's say we have words, a word like yes. Ordinarily one says, well, yes has a meaning. But let's suppose we say it several times. Yes, 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 yes. It begins to be a kind of music. The meaning disappears and you start listening to the sound. And I would like you, as I go on talking, to stop trying to make any sense of what I'm saying. Just listen to the sound. Mantra teaches you to do this. This is one way. Now, there's more beyond it than that I can't go into tonight. There's not enough time. But that is the initial thing, that you learn to use sound to tease yourself out of thought, as does eternity. Another technique that is used is visualization. In the methods of Vajrayana, they visualize various beings that are called Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and you become these beings. You visualize also what are called chakras, meaning flower wheels within your body. And you visualize them so intensely that they become of equivalent reality to what we ordinarily call the real world taken in by the five senses. And through this you learn that there may be ever so many real worlds. So don't take this one too seriously. This world that you think now is the real world is the one you have permitted yourself to be talked into by a social consensus. And therefore, what we call the city, the hard streets, the solid mountains, etc., that's where it's at, see? But that's a result of hypnotic persuasion. So in these methods of visualization, you are taught that you can create many other different kinds of worlds and experience them just as really, even more really than dreams. And therefore, you see, you have, as it were, a choice of realities. And that finally, they all come down to the diamond, to that marvelous solid emptiness, which is you, which is your own mind, which is basic reality. And so then, if you understand that, you become, shall I say, delivered from anxiety. Only, I want to add this, the ambition to be delivered from anxiety is itself a fetter. Because what Tibetan Buddhism ultimately tells us is this. It does a very curious trick on us. See, we have a saying that anybody who goes to a psychiatrist ought to have his head examined. And so we could say that anybody who goes to a guru, to a master of wisdom, to some great lama, is a damn fool. Of course he's a fool, that's why he went. But here's the thing. Here is a group of people who over many centuries have most carefully studied all the strange things that the human mind can do. They've learned how to stay warm at 14,000 feet in freezing cold by practicing an exercise called tuma. They've learned how to travel enormous distances bouncing along the road, which is called lungampa. They've learned all kinds of extraordinary masteries of what a human being can do. But the point is, at the end of the line, what do you want with power? Let's suppose you have absolute power. This is obviously the ostensible goal of technology, is to control everything. And supposing you control everything, you know the future completely. You know the past entirely. And everything obeys your will. What's that like? It's like fucking a plastic woman. And nobody wants it. So through, you see, just as through learning that you can visualize all sorts of different kinds of reality, and that they can become as real as this, what we call reality here. And that you are really in charge of everything. Because what happens to you involuntarily, you wouldn't want something, you wouldn't want a situation in which there was nothing involuntary. How would you know what voluntary was unless something was happening involuntarily? So, of course, you can say, well, voluntarily I allow certain involuntary experiences. See? So it's a way of saying fundamentally, cool it, let go. It's all right. Stop crying in the night, baby. It's only from that position, you see, that you can begin to do anything effective in the world. I mean in terms of the constructive things that can be done for what we call culture, which is basically the idea of cultivation of the earth. You can do it only from that position. Because if you start to base a culture upon things like we call necessity, anxiety, or that Buddhists call trishna, which means craving, it all turns out to be a mess. Because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, one final point. As you look at Tibetan Buddhism as a Westerner, you will find it simultaneously fascinating and complicated. You will find it full of strange and exotic imagery which excites you, because it's not familiar. You know, it's not like God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, and all that Christian jazz. But it's got Mahavairocana, and Amitabha on one side, and Akshobhya, and Ratnasambhava, and Amoghasiddhi. Ooh, that's a new name for God, see? And it has magic in it. And, you know, the Tibetans, they've been used to that all their lives. But for us, that's way out. And you begin to see that those mandalas with these marvelous personages in it are almost like cross-sections of your own nervous system. I haven't been to Tibet, but I have been to Koyasan in Japan, where they have Vajrayana Buddhism. And I get the funny feeling that the whole place is vaguely electronic. For example, they have pagodas, and the spire on top of a 5-tiered pagoda is a rod with 9 rings around it. And I suddenly remember the first television antenna that was put on the Empire State Building in New York. It looks just like the same thing. And then they have these mandala-type temples with these various Buddhas in, arranged 5-fold, one in the center, and 4 in a ring around it. And I have just a strange feeling that, like when you cut a slice across a lotus stalk, and you see the tubes inside it, or you cut a piece of bracken, and you see the wonderful structure inside it. I have a feeling that all this is a kind of a look at one's own sliced mind as to what's really the principles in it, and it all comes down to a flower. The mandala, the lotus. That's what we're doing. That's life. Radiation. Whether it's going caressing radiation, like the receptive female organ, or whether it's crashing radiation, like the lightning, which is male. They fit together, and one is the other side of the other. Because, as I said, you wouldn't know what is unless you knew what isn't was. So don't be afraid. So that's the meaning of the fundamental symbol of Tibetan Buddhism, the jewel in the lotus, Mani Padme. Mani is this, the diamond, the lightning flash, the male force. Padma, the lotus, is the opening, the receiving, the receptive. And so you get Oh.